Welcome to the Empower, Create, Encourage podcast, dedicated to providing you with strategies and encouragement to improve the quality of your daily experiences. I'm joined by Dr. Bruce Chalmer, a couple psychologist and author of Betrayal and Forgiveness, How to Navigate the Turmoil and Learn to Trust Again. What is a simple way that you can describe betrayal and why it impacts us so profoundly?
Betrayal is based on the relationship you have with someone. A stranger can hurt you, but a stranger can't betray you. When we feel betrayed, it's when someone does something that we never would have thought they'd have done based on our relationship with them. And of course, it depends on the relationship. If you're in a monogamous, romantic relationship and somebody has sex with someone else, that's a betrayal. If a friend of yours with whom you don't have a sexual relationship has sex with someone else, that might be unwise, but that's not a betrayal. Of course, the other piece of it is it's not merely something unexpected, it's something big and bad.
Mm-hmm.
It's not some minor annoyance or something like that. It's something that somebody would feel threatens their view of the other person. People will question their own judgment. It sort of shakes your world when you've been betrayed.
Can you explain what happens in our brains and in our amygdalas when we're experiencing that betrayal, and maybe even when we have repeated experiences of betrayal?
You ask that as if you were confident that I'm a great expert on, the neurophysiology of the brain, and I will pretend to be one for the sake of answering your question, but I'm really not. You've identified it, of course. The left hemisphere amygdala specifically is the one that freaks out, and its job is to scream, metaphorically, when it detects a pattern that looks like something that's hurt you in the past. So when you've been badly hurt, when something has happened that has caused an enormous amount of pain, gets remembered in the brain. So anything that even remotely suggests that it's similar to something that has hurt you in the past is apt to cause something of a panic reaction. Before I worked with couples, I actually did a lot of work helping people recover from trauma. When somebody is dealing with something like PTSD, it's not really a disease. It's the workings of a healthy brain. It's what your brain is trying to protect you. Evolution's sort of interesting, tends to be quite efficient. We use the same mechanisms for freaking out. If a partner in an important relationship says something that makes us worried they might want to leave us, we use the same mechanisms to freak out as we do if a saber-toothed tiger is about to attack us for the second time. And there's some modification there. We do have these neocortices. It is a lot of the same mental equipment that happens. And so the freaking out can feel very much like you're in danger for your life. And really what's happened is somebody has done something that makes you feel in danger for your relationship.
To delve into that a little bit, because it sounds hilarious because we're not in any real threat. Our brain is hardwired for us to survive. And so the threat is, I don't know if I can survive this abandonment. I don't know if I can survive this betrayal. And so that's why it feels so huge. That's such a great way to explain that. For me, the hardest part about experiencing betrayal is that self-doubt, the low
Yeah,
self-esteem, and then the tanking self-worth that follow after that. What's one
yeah.
step that we can take to rebuild our relationship with ourselves and rebuild that trust with our instincts, our intuition, and our judgment?
When you're enough past the shock that you can have a little bit of space in your brain and body to think about something, I think forgiveness becomes a really important part. And I don't mean initially forgiving whoever hurt you, though I do think that tends to be important down the line to relieve yourself of the pain. But it's forgiving yourself first. And it's very much what you were saying about you doubt yourself initially. A lot of folks will doubt their own sanity, or they'll say, how could I have been so stupid? Or how could I not have protected myself from that? It's a natural thing to do. Again, it's another protection mechanism. If we get hurt by something, we always tend to blame ourselves, at least in part, even if that's not reasonable. I've worked with adults who were sexually abused at the age of 3 or something like that. And they will often, as adults, still blame themselves, even realizing on some rational level it's nonsense. I mean, how could a 3-year-old have done something different? But they'll still blame themselves because as kids, it's less horrible to blame yourself than to think like, oh my God, this is what the world is doing to me.
Yeah.
The people who are supposed to protect me are actually hurting me. I can't believe that. It must be that I'm bad. So we'll tend to blame ourselves. If you get betrayed in an important relationship, often there's some reason to blame yourself. It's like, well, not only maybe I should have known better, but maybe I was somehow part of creating these conditions. I don't
Mhm.
know. I talk about 3 steps to forgiveness, and it's funny because anytime some clever author, like I'm claiming to be, says 3 steps to something, take it with a large grain of salt. No, it doesn't work 1, 2, 3. It's not that simple. It's not like you just go one and then the other and the other. It's not how it works. Anyway, but I talk about 3 steps to forgiveness. And step one, indeed, is forgive yourself. What I mean by forgive yourself is get to that place where you're able to reflect enough that you can say, I wish I had known better. I wish I had information I didn't have. I wish I had wisdom I didn't have, judgment, whatever it is. But I didn't. Given who I was and what I knew and what I didn't know, I was doing the best I could. And when you can get to that place, you can say, okay, well, I don't have to keep beating up on myself. I can recognize, I wish it hadn't happened, but I couldn't prevent it. I was doing the best I could, and that's what happened. Step two, then, is forgiving the person who hurt you. And I want to be careful about how I use the word forgive here. Forgiveness doesn't mean necessarily restoring the relationship. Certainly doesn't necessarily mean restoring trust. You can forgive someone you have every intention of divorcing. You can forgive someone you have every intention of suing in court. Forgiveness doesn't imply it was no big deal or that you're going to forget about it or that you're just going to go back to the way things were. I'll love to quote Anne Lamott like so many people do at this point. She's a novelist who's written a lot about issues of forgiveness and, ways of being hurt. She says, to not forgive someone is like drinking rat poison and waiting for the rat to die, which I love that. It's like, yeah, you got to get the poison out of you. Then you can think about the rat. You might still have to deal with the rat. Or, of course, sometimes when you get the poison out of you, you realize, oh, they weren't a rat. They were just a person and they kind of messed up, but we've all messed up. And maybe you can restore the relationship. But whether or not you can, if you can extend that same understanding you extend when you forgive yourself to the person who hurt you, you can say, well, given who they were, I'm not saying it was right. I'm not saying it was moral. No. But given who they were and what they were thinking in the particular sequence of forces that were operating on them, I guess they were doing the best they could too. So I don't have to be so angry. Now I got to figure out what to do with them. That's step two. A third step, and you don't have to be religious to appreciate this step, I call it forgive God. Now, what do I mean by forgive God? I simply mean that idea that says, okay, I can forgive myself. I was doing the best I could. I can forgive the person who hurt me. They were doing the best they could. Now I have to forgive the fact that we live in a world where this stuff happens,
Mhm.
which is really painful. The classic theological question the theologians ask is, how could a good God let bad things happen to good people? And the usual answer is, well, there's free will. If we didn't have free will, and if God could make, nobody get hurt, then we wouldn't have free will and we wouldn't exist the way we exist, which is fine if you're into theological answers. But just more generally, accepting that there's some basic rightness to this whole business, no matter how painful it is. It's based on some stuff that's basically right to be what it is. Kind of has to be that way. Even though we can't possibly sort out all the forces, we haven't got a God's eye view of the universe. That's step three, I call forgiving God. And another word for that is faith. And again, I don't necessarily mean religious faith in any traditional sense, but I mean that mindset that says this whole existence business is basically right to be what it is. And so I'm going to have to work with it instead of rail against it.
Wow. I just want to pause because this is all so brilliant. Step
Sure.
one, I love how you're talking about asking these introspective questions about, oh, I wish that I had known this. How could I have done this differently? Because it's so important to understand how we create these stories and this meaning and symbolism and things that happen to us as a way that we explain it. And all of a sudden, I'm someone that always gets cheated on, equals, I don't deserve love. I don't deserve
Mm,
loyalty. Being so mindful of how that can happen, and then we unconsciously are now creating these negative feedback loops through those
mhm.
stories that we are narrating in our minds. So I think that's fantastic. Step two, that empathy and that ability to give grace and compassion of if I had been in these similar circumstances, I probably would have chosen this as well. If I had been
Yeah.
raised in a home where people didn't value this honesty or loyalty, this is the only way that I knew how to survive. Those were adaptive habits at the time. And then later on, oh no, this no longer serves me in this circumstance. So now it's a maladaptive habit, but understanding it probably served this person somewhere in their
Mhm.
childhood. And that's why they're still bringing it on because they haven't done the work to be able to identify how to do this in a healthy way. And so I think that's so great because I find that when I think in that way, I release a lot of that anger, that
Yeah.
poison, the question of why does God allow this to happen? How does this happen in our world is so important because this can tear down your faith in God. It can also tear down your faith in yourself. How does this happen
Mhm.
to me in my world? How does God allow this? But how did I allow this in my own world? The beauty of free will and having this human experience is we're learning how to navigate all of this.
That is a lot of hard spiritual work. And it, of course, doesn't just go one, two, three. That's not how it works. I find working with couples so inspiring, dealing with a lot of these hard issues, precisely because when people are able to do that, it's really inspiring. That doesn't mean they stay together. Sometimes they conclude, well, this isn't going to work, or I don't trust you. So building trust is a whole different thing. The forgiveness part, and I didn't coin this phrase, but I like it. I don't even know who coined it, but somebody points out forgiveness is an inside job. In other words, it's something you do yourself. You don't need someone else to get to forgiveness. Trust, on the other hand, that involves both parties. Rebuilding trust, it's very hard to do unless there's been a pretty substantial level of forgiveness. On both sides, interestingly,
Yeah.
because often the person who did, even when they've acknowledged clearly, oh, yeah, I'm the one who cheated, I'm the one who did wrong. The person who did it is already acknowledging, yeah, they shouldn't have done it. They know that. When they're actually able to look at their situation, both parties have some forgiving to do. The person who did the cheating often is certainly angry at themselves, of course, and often angry at the other person, justified or not, for being part of the context that led them to do something against their own values. There's a lot of work to be done there. And then in terms of building trust, they have to be able to trust that the person that they cheated on isn't going to hold it against them for the rest of their lives if they want to restore the relationship. And of course, the person who was cheated on has to be able to trust the other person wouldn't do that again. Nobody wants to be in a relationship where one person is the permanent criminal and the other is the permanent probation officer. That's just not a.
Sometimes we cast these roles and we just want to stay in that dynamic. That's why I'm such a big fan of diving into the deeper meaning of things and how we're thinking to say, okay, I need to change the way that I'm operating and I need to change the way that I'm showing up. Betrayal is so impactful. Is
Yeah.
there common traits that you've noticed in couples that are very happy and thriving in their relationships?
You teed up a great response there because that's how I like to talk about it. My wife Judy Alexander and I do a podcast called Couples Therapy in 7 Words. Be kind, don't panic, and have faith. Never mind all the particulars of the particular theoretical orientation I'm coming from. What am I actually doing? Basically, if I think about it, essentially I'm trying to tell people and help people get to this. Be kind in the sense of kinship. Recognize your kinship. I don't just mean be nice to each other. We should all be nice, but we aren't always nice, are we? Be kind, I don't mean be a pushover. Recognize your essential kinship because that's what keeps people together. And if you're panicking, you can't do that. When I first see couples, they are often in some kind of panic. I'm using the word panic very broadly. I don't mean like full-fledged panic disorder panic, but they're in some kind of like panic state. They can't think clearly. They're reacting largely and very emotionally, and that's, normal stuff. A lot of the techniques you learn are about helping people back away from panic so that maybe they can think a little bit and hear themselves think. I started sharing that with folks I was working with. They would say, wow, that's a really interesting formula when you put it that way. Tell me, how do you not panic? The couples that seem to be able to get through this stuff are the ones who are manifesting faith, not necessarily religious faith. I have met religious people that I don't think are manifesting the kind of faith I'm talking about. And I have met people who are not at all religious that are. The couples that didn't, let's say, they would come in and they would say, oh my God, this is terrible. The person who cheated is feeling terrible. Of course they are. I mean, that's if they have any sort of conscience. But what they're saying is, we just want to go back to how it was. Make this go away. Let's find a way to get past this so we don't have to think about this anymore. That is the opposite of faith. Because what they're saying is, I just want to deny that this happened. The person who did it is saying, I don't know, I must have been crazy. I'll never do it again. I've learned from this. Never mind. They're not manifesting faith. The couples that come in and say, this is terrible. We're feeling awful. It's really painful. Fly into panic and, break down and cry and all that sort of stuff frequently. But we realize, and they're both saying it in their own way, it sucks, but there's something meaningful about this. The one who was cheated on is saying, look, I know you're not crazy. I know you're not fundamentally evil. I know you're not stupid. Yes, we all know it was wrong, but you did choose to do it. There must be something under it for you. What were you thinking? What's going on? We're going to have to get at the meaning of this. And moreover, they might also say, and I was part of creating that context. I'm not blaming myself for somebody else's immoral action. But I was part of creating that context. I better look at that. What was going on for us that led us to this? That's faith. That's what I mean by faith. Those are the couples that come out with something that's meaningful. Often they will stay together and be much better off for it. Sometimes they will realize, oh, bummer, we're two good people, but this is not going to work. They'll figure out how to split up in a way that's reasonably humane.
That's so interesting because there's so many different kinds of betrayal. It's not just having sex with someone who's not your partner,
Yes.
it's hiding
Yep.
finances or being the only one dominating in the relationship that's deciding how the finances are used, or even just being the dominating person in the relationship and not considering your husband or your wife in choices that you're making. There's so many different kinds of betrayals every day that happen. What kind of restitution can you do in those instances? Like, what's one thing that you would say to the person who has betrayed their spouse's trust to say, okay, this is one step that you can take to let your spouse know you want to earn their trust back and that you're respecting them as a person and you're honoring them?
Oddly enough, you're going to have to recognize that presumably you're not crazy, evil, or stupid. You yourself, the one who did it. That's a level of responsibility that is a harder level than the people who just say, oh, I was temporarily insane. No, you're actually going to have to own up to this in ways that may be challenging to your partner. You're going to have to be honest with yourself and honest with your partner. And that's difficult and scary because you may piss off your partner, first of all. It may convince your partner that, it shouldn't work. But if you're going to actually make restitution, that emotional restitution, you need to give them the respect of actually being honest. And that means being honest with yourself first. And you can't be honest with yourself if you're just completely beating up on yourself. For someone to be able, let's say, to offer a meaningful apology, they actually have to be coming from a place of self-validation. They have to recognize I am a valid human being who screwed up royally, but I am a valid human being. That's what lets me say, wow, I know I shouldn't have done this. I'm going to actually have to look at why I did without flinching from that. And then I can maybe offer you a genuine apology that says, I understand why I did what I did. I did choose it. I wish I hadn't now, but I did choose it. This is where I was coming from. And if you can understand that enough, maybe you can find a way to trust me. But if you can't, I can understand it. That's what someone can do. It can do the work of actually understanding themselves.
Sylvia Galvis, the founder of Authentic Transformation Corporation, she talks about how no one can change from a place of criticism, shame, or judgment. If we
Yeah.
want to change any behavior that we don't like that we're doing, we have to learn how to observe what we're doing and still have self-love and then introduce, okay, this is now how we're going to change moving forward.
Yeah.
You also
Yeah.
talk about the anxiety of intimacy and how to tolerate that. What do you mean about anxiety of intimacy, and what is one tool that we can have to manage it?
My first sessions are quite structured. After that, it's improv theater. That's how I actually write about that. The first session is quite structured. And among the things I do with folks is I give them a little talk about one of many ways of understanding why people couple up at all. Why does our species do what we do? Yes, we reproduce sexually, but all kinds of mammals do that just fine without actually forming couples. What are we after? A lot of ways of saying it, but my favorite way is to talk about two different sets of needs, stability and intimacy. And the reason I divide them because the skills you need for stability are very different from the skills you need for intimacy. For stability, the basic skills are all about keeping the anxiety level low, behaving in ways that don't freak out yourself or your partner. Cheating is a good way to destabilize. It spikes anxiety. And other forms of betrayal hugely spike anxiety. Staying mostly sober, things like that. People who have serious substance issues, it can be incredibly destabilizing. You can't rely on someone to show up or be present emotionally or mentally sometimes. The skills of stability are all about that, avoiding too much anxiety, trying not to upset your partner, which is a very noble thing to do. Who wants to be with somebody that's all about upsetting them? Intimacy is every bit as much a need as stability is. That's my basic axiom. Instead of trying to avoid anxiety, the basic skills of intimacy are all about tolerating anxiety. Now, why do I say intimacy requires that you tolerate anxiety? I mean, sometimes people look at me funny and say, well, if you talk about intimacy, isn't that supposed to feel good? They're thinking, well, intimacy meaning sex. I include sex there often, but I'm defining intimacy much more broadly. Intimacy is when you are present and honest with yourself and each other.
Mm.
No couple is intimate 24/7 in that sense. I'm not present with myself 24/7. I can get distracted and you know how that is. But a couple needs enough of that. The roots of a plant provide stability, but intimacy is the energy for growth. If somebody comes along and paves a sidewalk over a growing plant, which why would they do that? They do it for stability, right? What is that plant going to try to do? It will try and crack the sidewalk, or it will die trying. It won't just sit there. And we've all seen cracked sidewalks with plants growing through them. That's true of a couple as much as it is of a plant. If intimacy is compromised, somebody's going to try and crack the sidewalk. Now, why would intimacy get compromised? Well, often because it's too scary to be honest with your partner.
Mm.
Something as simple as a garden variety complaint. hey, I wish you would do X, Y, or Z you're not doing, or I wish you wouldn't do X, Y, or Z that you are doing. You know that's not going to be fun for your partner to hear. It may raise their anxiety. It would probably raise your own anxiety, especially if you've had experience with your partner of those conversations kind of going off the rails.
Or
Then
even
it
with other
raises,
people.
or even with other people,
Yeah.
yeah, in other relationships, be they, romantic or otherwise, of course. And so if that's what you're used to, you will tend to avoid it. When people tend to avoid it, then that's intimacy is compromised. And the symptoms of a couple where intimacy is compromised are what they will often find is they don't resolve issues. So virtually anything can be a trigger for an argument or a deep freeze. They'll walk on eggshells around each other, or someone will get very depressed, or someone will blindside the other one by saying, I can't stand it anymore. I'm out of here. And the other one didn't even know that they felt that way. Or someone will have an affair. It's not the only reason people have affairs, but it's certainly one of the big ones because they're feeling like intimacy is compromised. They become vulnerable to getting that somewhere else because it's a need. We
Yeah.
need to feel that sense of feeling alive. It feels very dead when intimacy is cut off in a couple. Tolerating the anxiety of intimacy is key. So that's the partial answer to your question. How do you do that? If I was going to answer it in one word, that's what I mean by faith. Faith is that which lets you do that. It's that mindset that says, faith doesn't say you know exactly how it's going to turn out. I don't mean, oh, everything will be fine. I don't know what fine is. I mean, maybe it'll be fine, maybe it'll be awful. I don't know. But something about it is, I'm equipped to live. That's a statement of faith. Of course, it's painful sometimes. I hope for more pleasure than pain, but pain is part of the deal. And so I'm going to have to be brave enough to face the music, figure out, okay, what do I need to do here? That's what facilitates intimacy. And so a lot of the work of therapy is about providing a space where people can feel not that they won't be anxious at all. Of course they'll be anxious, but where they can feel that anxiety without crossing over into freak out. A lot of the job of the therapist really is to be the one nervous system in the conversation that's not freaking out.
One of the greatest things in therapy that I've learned is just leaning in and feeling things and
Yeah.
not running away from that. Because one of the things that can happen as well is we can withdraw and we say, I need to protect myself, I need to protect myself. And all of a sudden, I'm not engaging in this relationship. I'm not showing up, I'm not being present. And a lot of that intimacy, emotionally and sexually, fizzle out because people are not feeling seen, they're not feeling heard, they're not feeling loved and valued. Sometimes we can do that with ourselves. It's like, okay, I don't want to bring this up anymore. So I'm going to ignore this. I'm going to gaslight myself and I'm going to ignore this. I'm going to pretend this doesn't bother me. I'm not going to be honest with myself.
Hmm.
It's correct me if I'm wrong here, but I do feel is not even the right word. I theorize. We can only be as honest with other people as we are with ourselves. I think there's a strong correlation there between the skills that I have learned in my relationship with myself and then how I can now apply that into interpersonal relationships. Have you
Oh,
noticed that in your work?
oh, sure. Yeah, I don't even separate them. That notion of speaking your truth, so to speak, if you're not honest with yourself, I don't know how you find any kind of truth. Even that is not black and white. Do you know what I mean? It's not all or
Mhm.
nothing. But it seems to me always part of the work that someone has to do to learn to be honest with themselves, even when it's kind of scary.
Yeah.
So that intimacy with oneself, that recognition that, wow, these are among the things I feel. It's not like we feel one thing at a time. That's not how it works. You know the work of Jill Bolte Taylor. Does that name ring a bell? She's a neuroscientist. When she was in her 30s, she had a massive left hemisphere hemorrhagic stroke, and it left her without the functions of her left hemisphere for a number of years. Now, who better than a neuroscientist to describe what the heck is going on, right? So she had recovered enough by 2008 to do what became the first viral TED Talk. It's called My Stroke of Insight.
Mhm.
She talks about what she learned over those next few years, where she didn't have the part of her brain that is mostly the part that's about logic and sort of linear understanding. And it's also the part that gets pissed off. And it's not that she didn't feel upset or anything like that, but it was a very different quality to it without her left hemisphere. And what was interesting, as she described it, or as I recall her describing it, was when her left hemisphere came back on over time, it healed. And as it healed, she started learning how to be pissed off again. And the funny part was she discovered that she didn't have to keep talking herself into it. That if you don't keep talking yourself into staying pissed off, which is a left hemisphere function, it's a narrative function,
Hmm.
primarily left hemisphere. None of these things are perfectly divided, but primarily left hemisphere function. If you don't keep talking yourself into staying pissed off, it's only going to be about 90 seconds that that left hemisphere amygdala will be firing. Once it realizes, okay, danger doesn't seem to actually be happening here, it calms down in about a minute and a half. If you keep talking yourself into it, you can keep yourself pissed off for decades. Literally decades. People will do that. They'll just keep reciting why they're so justified in being angry. The reason I'm bringing up Joe Bolte Taylor in this context, she wrote another book called Whole Brain Living. Her essential thesis is that we are all four different people. And she's very whimsical and funny about how she writes about it. I was explaining this to my wife when I was reading the book. She's a few years younger than me, but she's a boomer also. We're boomers. For those who can't see us, I mean, I don't mind telling you, I'm 74 years old. I'm not a spring chicken. My wife is 67. What would you call your four characters? Joe Bolte Taylor says, name your four characters. My wife immediately said, oh, I know, John, Paul, George, and Ringo, of course. That'd be what you would name them. There's something to that. That's like the Beatles were, they kind of did represent these four different kinds of characters. That's what made them so amazing, synergistically. Her thesis is we're all four different people walking around. One of them is the one that freaks out, the one she calls character two. That's the left hemisphere amygdala one. That's the one that freaks out. But the other three, the left hemisphere neocortex is just trying to understand things linearly and analyze and plan. And, that's the one that's telling the stories in words. The right hemisphere amygdala just wants to have fun and doesn't really think much about the consequences. So it can get you in a little bit of trouble. But it's not the one that freaks out. It just wants to have fun. And the right hemisphere neocortex is the one that is in touch with the universe. That's the one that can meditate. That's the one that can experience these, peak experiences. And they're all there and they're all active. And it's just the one that freaks out. And it can be very dominant when it freaks out because it's there to save your life. Her idea is if you can learn to get those four parts together in yourself, then you can actually learn to take care of that character two when it freaks. And if you get a couple and they're both in their character two, they're not going to get very far having a conversation because they're both panicking at each other. When I first meet couples, that's often where they are, full panic mode, character two mode, and both of them using her terminology.
That's such a fascinating premise for a book. I'm so excited
Yeah.
to read that. I'm going to add that to my reading list.
Yeah, check it out. It's fun. She writes very whimsically. She maps her four characters onto various other people's systems just to show there's some commonality there.
There's a difference between abuse and betrayal. And so, for people that aren't sure whether they're experiencing betrayals or abuse in their relationship, what are some good questions that they can ask to find out? And what are some signs that you are in an abusive relationship?
A lot of times people will tolerate being treated certain ways out of genuine love for someone, feeling like, well, maybe I can help them do better, or I can understand why they would get upset or whatever. If you're in a relationship that puts you at serious risk of harm, especially physical harm, of course, really a lot of the work of figuring out, are you in an abusive relationship, by which I would simply mean a relationship that you better get the hell out of.
Hmm.
That's what I mean by an abusive relationship. So that's really the operational question. Never mind if you call it abuse or not. Are you in something you need to get out of? I don't have a simple black and white test for that. But if you are, you need to get out first. Then worry about whether you can do something about the relationship or not. You need to get yourself safe first.
To
That's
expand
just
on
the
that a
general.
little bit, because I find that there's two sides. It's like, this isn't working, get out. And it's like, okay, we can still
Mhm.
fix this when there's not
Yeah.
abuse and there's not betrayal. Because now we're in an era of, if this doesn't make you happy, leave it. It's not about
Yeah.
honoring your commitments or anything. So there's that side of it, which I don't agree with. But then there's also the side of it of, I can change him, I can change her. I should
Yeah.
be more loving, I should be more Christ-like, and not realizing this is hurting you.
Yeah.
I guess what's a good question to determine, is this okay for my well-being still, or do I need to leave? How do you know when you need to get the hell out and when you can actually stay and work
Yeah.
through it?
We all know folks, if you think back in your, yeah, I'm old enough to have known a lot of folks. I've known people who I have thought, certainly, and many of their friends have thought, oh my God, you should get out of this. This is not good. You have to balance a bunch of different considerations that all seem to me to be valid. And sometimes you're going to get it wrong and get badly hurt. And I
Mhm.
suppose the best you can do, if God forbid, unless you're killed by it, the best you can do is learn from it. That's awful. But I don't think there is I can't think of one anyway, a litmus test that would say, here's the question to ask yourself. And if the answer to this is yes, get out. And if the answer to this is no, hang in there.
I
I
guess the
have
first
similar,
question that
yeah,
comes to mind is, do I feel safe with this person?
yeah, except that often people don't feel safe and still stay in it because you never feel perfectly safe with someone. Loving someone is put you in a very vulnerable position. You know
Mm.
they're going to hurt you. It's a matter of degree. It's hard. And then the other considerations that are often there are practical considerations. Am I going to be destitute if I leave this person? Yes, indeed. The safety issue often, of course, comes up where it's actually very clear to someone. It's like, I know I need to get out. I have to figure out how to get out alive
Yeah.
because the most dangerous time often is when somebody says they're leaving.
Do not ever say you're leaving. Just get your plan and then leave.
Yes,
Domestic
exactly.
violence is so high, and murder in domestic violence is high.
Yeah, that's horrendous. Find people who can help you, and there are often organizations around it. They changed the name of it, but it used to be Women Helping Battered Women, is what they used to call
Mhm.
it. They are really wise people, many of whom had been through it themselves, and they were incredibly helpful. But those aren't the ones you're talking about. Those, like, the person knows what they need to do. They just
Mhm.
have to figure out how to do it. I'm talking about the ones where they don't. They
Yeah.
don't know. They're just really conflicted. When I'm talking to a couple where it's definitely not abusive, I do have a little bit of advice there for people who are in a relationship that's really painful, but it's not like unsafe in that acute sense. It's unhappy, but not unsafe. And what I will often say is figure out if your problems are deal breakers or growing pains. And deal breakers, I don't mean just very painful. You can have very painful things that aren't deal breakers because maybe you can grow and learn and make the changes you need to make. Deal breakers are things that are logical deal breakers. It's like one person, it's amazing how many couples I've worked with where they never talked about do they want to have kids. And come to find out, one of them, of course, we want to have kids, right? And the other saying, oh no, you didn't realize I never want to have kids. Well, you can't compromise on that. You can't sort of have a kid. You can either have one or not, and unless one changes their minds, that's a deal breaker. It isn't going to work. And there's other deal breakers as well. Like where you want to live sometimes becomes a deal breaker. It's like, ah, we're so good together, but I got to be close to my parents and you got to be close to your parents and they're thousands of miles apart. It's not going to work. If it's not a deal breaker, my advice there is it's growing pains. And I say, if it's growing pains, don't break up in a panic. Don't break up merely to reduce the pain, although I certainly respect that. Learn what you need to learn. And then if you break up, you'll be much better off than if you just break up in a panic. To decide, okay, do I leave or do I not leave? I tend to say, if you keep having to ask yourself that question, you should probably leave. If you keep saying, oh my God, is this abusive? If you keep having to ask that question, it probably is. I mean, that's one way of thinking about it. And I don't want to mansplain to you. You're the expert on women in the conversation.
There's a term that you also talk about that I really liked. You talk about sacred sex, and I love the
Ooh.
intention and exclusivity of that. What do you
Mhm.
define as sacred sex, and how can couples cultivate that?
Oddly enough, I'm not referring to the sacred that's the exclusive part. I'm kind of assuming that part. Uh, so it's interesting. I like that though. That's a good point because yes, people will often say, "Well, sex is sacred to our relationship," and the word "sacred" does mean set apart. That's the
Mhm.
original, the term in Latin and also the similar term in Hebrew. Kadosh has that feeling of it's set apart for a specific, for something special. It's set apart. I talk about three levels of sex. Plain old sex, good sex, and sacred sex. Plain old sex is whatever you think it is. I'm not fussy about how you define the term. It's not just intercourse, it's whatever you think it is. Anything involving something you call sex. Even for plain old sex, you have to not be freaking out. And so people who have been sexually traumatized, for
Mhm.
example, often have a lot of healing to do before they can even have plain old sex. You could say, well, it's a way of being physically intimate with someone. That's plain old sex. To graduate from that to what I call good sex, which is a kind of a judgmental term, but what I mean by good sex is intimate sex. And I don't mean tender and quiet, I don't mean intimate in that sense, because it can be quite vigorous and rough or whatever people like. What I mean by good sex is when you both show up. When you are the same thing I talked about intimacy earlier. Intimacy is when you're present and honest with yourself and each other. When you're present and honest with yourself in your body, in your mind, in your spirit, in your heart, with your partner doing the same, that's intimate sex. And that requires all the skills of intimacy. Oddly enough, tolerating anxiety. Because to be honest with your partner, I mean, for a couple to develop intimate sex involves a lot of intimacy, a lot of vulnerability, willingness to say to your partner, hey, more of this, less of that, or I like that and I don't like that, or I've been thinking I want to try something, but I'm kind of worried you're going to think I'm weird. All of that goes into good sex. So to be able to do that requires all the skills of intimacy. That's what I mean by good sex. Now, what do I mean by sacred sex? Sacred sex is where it's no longer just about the two people involved. I don't mean orgies. That's not what I'm talking about. Although there are people who are into that sort of stuff that would say that can be sacred too, and I believe it. I don't, it's not my not my area of expertise, let's put it that way. I'm just talking about even a couple, a monogamous couple. That sacred sex is when it's no longer merely about them. And really the concept of sacred sex is more about the sacred than it is about the sex. Why is sex such a good venue to experience the sacred? Well, because the forces involved in sex are awe-inspiring. Anybody who's ever had an orgasm, and I recognize there's some actually abusive contexts where that happens. I've met people where their first orgasm was at the hands of their father or something, which is incredibly damaging to someone's psyche. But I'm talking about more general, where people learn it by themselves or with a partner or whatever. Anybody who's
A positive
experienced that,
experience.
and a positive experience, especially, or even if it isn't all that positive, it's like it's often awe-inspiring. It's like, oh my God, where did that come from? Those sorts of forces that take you out of yourself are really amenable to that experience of the sacred. The experience of the sacred is, again, when it's no longer just the two of you at that point. The same book where I have the chapter Sex, Good Sex, and Sacred Sex, I have another chapter, Why Get Married? And I point out there's virtually no stigma anymore, living together, even having kids,
Mhm.
all that stuff without getting married. And the proportion of women in the United States having babies who aren't married is now close to half. And many of those women, it's not just that they're doing it themselves. A lot of them are with a committed partner, but they've chosen not to get married. So it's interesting. So why bother getting married if you can, it certainly doesn't guarantee anything. You know that. It doesn't guarantee fidelity. It doesn't guarantee that you're going to stay loving each other. It doesn't guarantee anything.
Mhm.
Why do it? Well, what I say is the reason for doing it is actually the same idea as sacred sex, because it takes your relationship and says it's no longer just about the two of you. And again, you don't even have to be religious or mystical to sort of invoke that. When you get married, it's the whole community that's involved. And of course, in a religious sense, when you get married before God. You get married, you're saying that this isn't just about us anymore. The sacredness of sex is when it's not just about the two of you, you're connecting with forces that are way bigger. It's all about connecting with these massive forces of the universe that aren't just about the two of you anymore. And that can be a profound experience. And like any kind of peak experience, you can't just snap your fingers and make it happen.
Mhm.
You can lay the groundwork for it. So, I tend to say it's sort of like a cumulative course. To have good sex, you have to be able to have plain old sex. To have sacred sex, you have to be good at good sex already because you have to be present. Doesn't guarantee you'll have these transformative, these transcendent moments a lot, but you've created the conditions where maybe it'll happen.
Sex can be loaded with lots of fear, insecurity, or even avoidance.
Oh
How can
yeah.
couples begin to reclaim sex so that it's not just the act of sex or intimacy, but as a space for healing and connection to really have that sacred sex?
That very question is a good start. Have you considered getting in touch with your own body, your own sexuality, by yourself even is an important step. And then when you're talking about partners, to be able to do that with each other requires enormous tolerance of anxiety, willingness
Mhm.
to be very vulnerable. And on the other side of that, willingness to be very compassionate. I say to couples, anytime they are communicating with each other, they should imagine if they turn on the closed captioning, like in a video, what you will see is not only what they're saying to each other, like if somebody says, hey, what time are you picking up the kids? In addition to hearing the question, what time are you picking up the kids? You should also look at the closed captioning where it says, by the way, do you love me? Do you respect me? Do you
Mhm.
honor me? Are we okay with each other? Are we still good? And you want the answer when you say 4:30. You also want your closed captioning to be saying, by the way, the answer to all your questions is a resounding yes.
Ah, I
And
love that so much. Can we just
yeah,
pause on
and
that for a second? Because you're also talking about the Gottman's work. They talk about how
yes,
different things are
absolutely.
bids for connection. And we're looking to
Yes.
see, do they love me? Do they respond to me? Do they see me? It's so valuable. I love that. There's so much more meaning behind, hey, can you please do the dishes? Hey,
Yes.
I got you your favorite pistachio ice cream. Oh my goodness, you see me, you love me. Oh, I love that. That's so brilliant. Thank you.
One of the things I especially like in quoting John Gottman in one of my books, I have a book with a very snarky title, my second book. It's called It's Not About Communication, Why Everything You Know About Couples Therapy is Wrong. Snarky title, right? By the way, the subtitle, Why Everything You Know About Couples Therapy is Wrong, in one of the last chapters of the book, I point out that that applies to me too. Everything I know about couples therapy is wrong too. It's the knowing, it's the thinking I know. if I think I have the last word on it, I'm going to do harm, not good. But getting back to Gottman, it's not about communication thing. That's, come on. Of course it is, right? Couples, they always want to communicate better, don't they? Well, of course they do. What I point out is if you teach couple communication skills, if you look at a couple that's doing well, look at a couple that they relax with each other, they enjoy each other. They're two human beings, so they're going to have differences sometimes. Look at how they talk about differences. It's all the stuff that Gottman showed in his Newlyweds that do well down the line. They're listening to each other. They're not calling each other names. They're speaking with respect. They're responding to all those bids for connection, all that stuff. If you teach people to communicate like that, the fallacy is that will make them function well.
Mm,
It's backwards. They're functioning well, not because they're communicating that way. They're communicating that way because they're functioning well.
mhm.
If you teach them to communicate like that when they're not functioning well, teach them I statements, teach them active listening, teach them all your favorite communication tools. They will learn to insult each other more effectively with the tools. You can be every bit as nasty and contemptuous, again, referring to Gottman's work, one of the four horsemen, contempt. You can express contempt through an I statement just as well as you can with a you statement.
Yeah.
You don't even have to be that clever. It's going to come through. The point isn't to use the I statements. If you're doing well, I statements are silly. A couple that is doing well mostly implement those rules. They won't do it formally, but that's what you'll observe. Yeah, they're not yelling at each other.
It's more casual. You don't have to
Yeah, of
use the
course.
therapy speak to get into each
Yes.
other's good graces. What I like
Yeah,
about what you're saying, though, is the thing that I've learned is learning how to be regulated is the most important thing.
absolutely.
I know these things logically, yet having been pregnant for the first time and having given birth for the first time, I've never experienced the raging hormones that I did during that time. And I thought that it could have been how it was during my period. Oh, I have willpower and I have a growth mindset and I know the tools and blah, blah, blah. Out the window did not matter. I was just like, I'm feeling rage. I'm not regulated. I don't have the skills right now. So I think that's so important to learn how to regulate ourselves so that we can practice those skills. Something that's really hard to stay regulated in sometimes is talking about sex with your spouse. Some couples have different levels of desire or different needs in sex. So, how can they talk about these differences and navigate these differences without shutting down or giving up on sex altogether?
It is so easy to fall into a really vicious cycle where they end up giving up on it together and both parties feel terrible about it. It's really interesting how that can happen. It requires an enormous amount of questioning some of your assumptions, relaxing some of the standards. For example, that situation you described where one person has a lot less libido in general than the other, and libido is very complex, it turns out. Talk about hormones. I mean, my God, there's a lot of hormone stuff involved. There's a lot of relational stuff involved, a lot of medical stuff involved, age, everything else, all that stuff plays into it. Often gendered this way, though not always. There's such a thing as spontaneous libido and responsive libido. And women especially often are bigger in the responsive libido department than the spontaneous. And there are lots of exceptions to this, of course, for both men and women. But very often that is the case more for women than for men. What will happen is the woman will often feel like, I want to be nice to him because he's got the spontaneous libido going. I don't object to the fact that he desires me. I don't have it the way he has it. But once we get going, he happens to be a considerate lover. He knows how to make it nice for me. I really do enjoy it. After we're done, I'm thinking, I don't care if we do that again soon, but I know he wants to. So I will invite myself there. Well, for a lot of women, they would feel like, oh my God, that's artificial and I should never do that. Even worse, for a lot of men, they would feel like, I don't want mercy sex. I want her to want me.
Mhm.
If she doesn't have that spontaneous feeling like I do, it's invalid. Well, that's a recipe for disaster.
Yeah.
And when a couple can look at that and relax a little so that maybe she decides it's a lovely thing to offer. It's not like he's just using her. It's like, no, she's enjoying it too. It's just that it was more his idea than hers. Okay. If you can make that be okay, then you'll be fine. What happens for a lot of couples is they can't make that be okay, and then there's resentment that builds. And then, largely for the woman involved, she'll start feeling like, how can he want to have sex with me when I'm so pissed off all the time because he's being such a jerk?
Hmm.
For men, it'll often be like, if she only would accept me, I would feel intimate, and then maybe I wouldn't be such a jerk. I'm not trying to justify it. They'll get themselves in that nasty cycle. Broadly speaking, the way out of it is to consider things you wouldn't have considered. Like scheduling sex, the sort of thing like, oh, people, no, you can't schedule it. It has to be this, spontaneous thing. Well, guess what? For a lot of couples, and this is independent of libido, if you don't schedule it, it's not going to happen. And it turns out it's good for your relationship. So maybe schedule it. That doesn't take away consent. You
Hmm.
schedule it, and either party is free to say, oh, just sorry, it's just not going to happen now. Huge, important skill, especially in the sexual domain, important intimacy skill is the willingness to disappoint your partner and not be a jerk about it. And of course, hugely important skill on the other side, the willingness to be disappointed without being a jerk. You're together with someone long enough, a sexual relationship, the moment will arise when one party's saying, "Hey, want to do it?" and the other party is saying, "Ah, geez,
Yeah.
not into it."
And also,
And
not
how,
every encounter is going to be magical and fireworks,
oh
right?
my God, yes.
Especially because there can
Yeah.
be a lot of shame around sex, even with our partners. Why is there that stigma of that shame where, oh, I can't really say what kind of sex I want to have? I can't really say that I didn't like this.
Oh yeah.
How can we overcome that?
People learn shame around sex very young in our culture in general.
Hmm.
And so it's not surprising that a lot of folks are trained to not talk about it or to be ashamed to talk about it or just assume you don't talk about it or assume your partner wouldn't want to talk about it. All of the above. It's about risking. In therapy, you can invite people to recognize it's like, it turns out a lot of things you're assuming maybe aren't so. And if you actually talk
Yeah.
about them, risk talking about them, you'll learn something.
Do you think that would be what gets in our way the most from having the best possible sex we can with our spouse, not being willing to take that risk to talk about it, or do you think it's
Oh,
something
yeah.
else?
I sure would put that up way up there. Yeah. It's amazing to me how many couples I work with that are generally quite willing to talk about stuff, but they just don't go there with sex. They just feel too, and it isn't always shame. It's at risk, and
Mhm.
emotionally. It just feels too scary to say, gee, I've been thinking about this, but fantasy is a great example of that. A lot of fantasies people have are, to say the least, not politically correct. People worry that if they have a fantasy of something that's just wrong, rape fantasies being a classic example, huge percentages of women, it turns out, he says mansplaining to the woman again, but huge percentages, I read the research, it's large percentages of women occasionally have
Have rape
fantasies of being,
fantasies.
yeah,
Yeah.
rape fantasies are being taken. I mean, if you want to say it in a better way that it doesn't sound as awful,
An
but taken against
abduction
their
fantasy.
will, except that we had someone on our podcast who kind of specializes in fantasies. She pointed out it's so interesting that women, when they have rape fantasies, often will be quote unquote raped just the way they like. In other words, it's the fantasy, you're still in control. You really haven't relinquished
Yeah.
control. But there's something about the fantasy of being taken by someone that's really sexy for a lot of people, especially women. To say that, oh my God, it sounds like how can I be a self-respecting person and say that? And for men, similarly, wanting to be dominated or wanting to be dominant or whatever the fantasies are, to be able to talk about that and recognize, first of all, just because you talk about that doesn't mean you have to do exactly what you're fantasizing. You can
Mhm.
incorporate those fantasies into your play without actually doing anything dangerous or horrible.
And then also having a safe word, which lots of people have, to
Of
let them know
course.
I've reached my limit in this fantasy. We can try again.
Yeah, yeah.
Is there a pattern that you've noticed that men and women need for fulfilling sex? In what ways are they different and in what ways are they similar?
There's all kinds of characteristic ways that men as a group and women as a group are different. Men as a group want to use sex to feel intimate. It's not that men don't want intimacy, by the way, but we want to use sex to feel intimate. And women as a group want to feel intimate before you're interested in having sex. There's all kinds of really good evolutionary reason why that is true. Because let me look it up. I believe you guys are the ones who get pregnant, aren't you? Right? In other words, the female of our species, the ramification of having sex is very different than the male. It's a much more complex or a much more fraught
Vulnerable.
decision. Yeah, you're
Yeah.
much more vulnerable in so many ways. Even literally, the idea of admitting someone into you as opposed to entering someone else is a very different thing. So there's all kinds of reasons why it's different for men and women. Again, characteristically. I say characteristically men this and women that. Oh my God, there's so many people where it's the other way around. The area of sex is just incredibly broad and I'm not specifically a sex therapist per se. Any couples therapist ought to be able to talk about sex. Couples that have a healthy sex life often have a healthy intimate life more generally, not always, usually. And vice versa. If they don't, they often have intimacy issues more generally. It's either part of their lives or they thought about it, decided it isn't part of their lives, but it's a huge part of their lives.
I'm
Mm.
curious, what would be the smallest possible step that couples can take to become better partners and improve their relationship?
It's my 7 words. Be kind, don't panic, and have faith. Think about those words. That's a small step. Recognize your kinship, and if that's compromised, it may be because you're in a panic. The antidote to panic is to do the practice of faith. I mean, I could be really ridiculous and say, well, buy my books and that'll take care of all your problems, but that's a little bit arrogant, so I won't say that.
That's a wrap for today. Thank you for listening to the Empower, Create, Encourage podcast. If you liked it, share it and subscribe for more. Remember, you're empowered to create the life, the love, and the reality that you want. Espero que tu día esté lleno de magia y alegría. Con mucho cariño. Nos vemos prontito.